Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to do this. The last time I spoke for the New York Mythology Group was back in 2013, and I had just finished my doctoral program at Pacifica Graduate Institute, a school that I love and I highly recommend. And it's a school that is focused around Joseph Campbell and Jungian depth psychology. And I really found it a powerful place. And the reason why I'm talking about it at the very beginning is because my way in to mythology is definitely through the archetypal and through the depth psychology, through the meaning of the images and the meaning of the narrative and the interpretations of the narrative, but also how that then translates and can be seen in the world. Because I've come to believe, and a lot of my work centers around the idea that pretty much almost everything boils down to narratives. Not that events don't occur, but that are immediately, the way the mind works is that our interpretation creates a narrative about what we just experienced, and then we go forth with that narrative, and so does everyone else. And so that's where understanding our stories becomes so crucial. And now at this point in time, this year, this amazing year of 2020, with so many things occurring and so many stories coming at us from various directions, that there's a line that's being blurred between what is truth and what is constructed narrative. And is there a clear delineation? Or is it all constructed narrative and we have to choose which narrative resonates with us? And that's kind of a little bit scary and a little bit unsettling, along with everything else that's unsettling that's happening right now. So one of the ways that I chose to go into this is through Narcissus. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I hope I get to everything. I'm a middle school teacher as well as a college professor. I have a tendency to over-prepare, so I will cut down as I go, as I notice the time. But I'll start off with talking about the story of Narcissus, and there's a few different subtle versions to it. And then talk a little bit about narcissism as a personality disorder, and then the nature of perception, the shadow and the other. And then I'm going to delve into reality TV and news, which seems like it would be a complete departure from where I was, but I'm hopefully going to make the connection for you about why the advent of reality television, I believe, has added to our sense of being Narcissus in the world right now. And that's reality TV and social media and news and all of that we're going to get into. And then the idea of propaganda as myth making, or I should have, instead of saying propaganda, more intentional narrative setting for an audience and for an agenda. And we'll talk about that. The symbol of seeing 2020, because that probably those of you who are into mythology and symbolism, that has not escaped you. The 2020 of the vision, clear vision, and this crazy 2020 year. Then I'm pondering whether or not Narcissus would be willing or able to attempt to see the world more clearly. Would he even care to? And that actually formed the basis of my dissertation, which was that I wanted to redeem Narcissus. And my dissertation chair, Dr. Christine Downing, if anyone is familiar with her, said to me, "You can't redeem Narcissus. That's the whole point of Narcissus." And I said, "I'm going to try." So we're going to talk a little bit about that towards the end. And maybe it was a little bit of a fool's journey, but I remain optimistic. So let's talk about the myth of Narcissus first. I love this quote by Robert Romanishin, a Jungian analyst. He said, this is talking about Narcissus, one cannot stay forever or even for very long before the mirror noticing the reflection. Indeed, to do so may even be dangerous. Narcissus, after all, lingers before the mirror forever, and we are aware of his fate. His involvement with the reflection leads to death. So part of what I hope to talk about in this story today with Narcissus and in this talk is not so much about him being full of himself, which is one interpretation of the Narcissus myth, but his inability to differentiate illusion and reality and to be able to interpret what he's seeing clearly. That is the part that has always fascinated me. So I start here with Caravaggio's painting of Narcissus, and almost all of the paintings of Narcissus involve that fateful moment of him gazing at himself, at his own reflection, and being unable to understand exactly what he's seeing and pull himself out of it. I'm sure there are other statues and artwork that depict other aspects of the story, most notably probably with Echo and that dynamic, but quite a lot of them have him gazing at his reflection, and I believe that there's a reason for that. And so this image is probably one that people have seen most often. It's John William Waterhouse's painting of Narcissus, again gazing at himself in the pond, in the lake. And I want to just very quickly, for those of you not as familiar with Narcissus' story, tell you the story of Narcissus. So Narcissus was the son of Liriope, a river nymph, and Cephissus, one of the river gods. So he was mortal, but he did have divine parentage. And so he was born a very, very beautiful child. And when he was just born, his mother brought him to Tiresias, who was a blind seer, and asked, what can you tell me about my son? What is his destiny? What is his life going to be like? Will he grow old? And Tiresias says, well, yes, if he never comes to know himself. And you have to wonder about the interpretation of to know thyself, because we've heard that with Socrates. We hear that kind of over and over again, this idea of knowing who you are. But some interpretations of this is that the connection of his reflection, really knowing himself and relating to himself, or really knowing who he is and what he is stuck in that illusion. And so there's some question as to exactly how that's interpreted, but I think that that's part of the fun of myth, right? So as he lives his life, he has a lot of suitors. He has a lot of young women who fall madly in love with him. He has a lot of men who fall madly in love with him. There's an older story from Conan, which is in, let's see, I have the date written down here somewhere along the way, around the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE, who actually talks about a young man named Amenius, who falls in love with Narcissus. And Narcissus, to him, it doesn't matter whether it's male or female love interest. He's just really not interested in anyone. No one is really good enough for him. No one is beautiful enough. No one sparks his fancy. And he actually gives Amenius a sword, I guess, to do away with himself, to leave him alone. And Amenius does kill himself, but not before crying out to the gods, to Nemesis, to ask him to be cursed to fall in love with himself, or to be cursed to fall in love with someone he could never be with, right? So he could feel the same pain that they were feeling. A more recognizable version of the story comes from Ovid and a few other storytellers as well. The idea of Echo, the nymph who had lost her voice because Hera was vengeful and didn't want to hear her gossiping much more anymore about Zeus's exploits, and basically only allowed her to repeat the last words that someone else said. And one day, as she was wandering around, she saw Narcissus, this beautiful young man, and he was hunting stags. And she came up towards him, and he said, "Who's there?" And she repeated, "Who's there?" And they ended up having a conversation that was only her repeating the very words that he was saying, but he was getting more and more aggravated and really wasn't understanding. And she, in turn, thought that he was telling her to come to him because of some of the things he was saying. And so she ran to him and enveloped her arms around him, thinking that he was declaring his love for her. And he said, "Get away from me, you wretched young girl. I'm not interested." And that destroyed her. So that spurning of her love, she ran off into the caves, and eventually her voice was never heard again. She wasted away out of heartbreak. So Narcissus leaves behind him a trail of destruction, not only people's hearts, but eventually their deaths. It brings about their deaths, and also brings about his own demise. Because after this point, in various versions are that it was Aphrodite that was the plea was sent out to. In some versions, it was Nemesis, the goddess of retribution and judgment and rebalancing. And either way that you tell that story, they granted this same wish and they put a curse on him. And he was destined to fall in love with his own image. And so very soon thereafter, he saw his image in a pond and he went, "Oh, you're who I've been looking for my entire life." This was his beloved. He fell madly in love and he couldn't leave that spot. He was mesmerized by this image of who this person was. That was the person of perfection. But now that he had finally found the right person for himself, every time he reached towards the water and touched the water, the image rippled and disappeared. And when he would reach down and try and kiss the water with his lips, the same thing, the image would disappear. And he couldn't understand why every time he tried to connect with this image of his beloved, his perfect partner, they vanished. They became as illusory as they actually are. And he couldn't reconcile himself with this. Different versions of the myth have him never quite getting the fact that that's himself, and that he's stuck in that illusory moment of not understanding who he's looking at. And then some other versions, such as Ovid, have almost a bittersweet finale where he does realize that it is himself and it is a futile attempt at a love affair, but he's unable to stop because of the curse. And so in some senses, is that worse? So, and I bring that to our conversation today because is knowing that what you're looking at is illusion, but you're unable to break yourself out of the illusion, is that better or worse than not knowing that you're in an illusion altogether? And that's not a question that I can answer definitively. That will be something I will definitely open up for when we have our questions towards the end. But I think it's a fascinating thought to contemplate. So that's basically the story of Narcissus. And here is a quote from Ovid about that time, about that moment towards the end. "How many futile kisses did he waste on the deceptive pool? How often had he clasped the neck he saw but could not grasp within the water where his arms plunged deep? He knows not what he sees, but what he sees invites him. Even as the pool deceives his eyes, it tempts them with delights. But why, O foolish boy, do you persist? Why try to grip an image? He does not exist, the one you love and long for. If you turn away, he'll fade. The face that you discern is but a shadow, your reflected form. That shape has nothing of its own. It comes with you it stays. It will retreat when you have gone, if you can ever leave." And I just think that that really speaks for a lot of the place that many of us, whether we realize it or not, are finding ourselves in right now. With the information that is coming to us via news, via social media, via our friend echo chambers, and everything else. What we are seeing in some senses is a projection of ourselves. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. So I do want to touch on quickly narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder, because that is something that is always associated with Narcissus, and in fact was named, I'm pretty sure was named after the mythic character. And Freud is pretty much known to be the father of narcissism in terms of his writings. And so from this book on narcissism, an introduction, he delineates two types of narcissism. The first one is the one that most people think of when they think, and actually, I'm sorry, that's not true. The second one is the one that most people think of when they think of narcissism. The first one is the earliest development phase. It talks about that undifferentiated self and other of the child and the mother. That fact that you feel, I think it's Lacan in the mirror stage that talks about this as well too, that sense when you're a baby that you really can't differentiate yourself and other, but most primarily with your mother from whom you've just been born. Right? So there's a sense of who am I is wrapped up in a sense of someone else in the world. And then slowly there is this separation that occurs as we start to realize I am me, you are you, and that world of duality kicks in almost as a necessary developmental stage in order to be able to interact in the world. And so my background is also in non-dual philosophy, so I'm also fascinated by that moment that our mind separates ourselves from that space, and how so many people are attempting to move back to that after they have gotten older and lived in that dualistic experience of the world for so long. The second type of narcissism, secondary narcissism, is a withdrawal of the libido from others back onto oneself. Thus, it often serves as a defense mechanism created by the mind to inflate one's own sense of low self-worth. And that is that sense that, I mean, Freud talks a lot about a narcissism being kind of a sexual attraction to yourself. And there is that aspect of that libido. It's not necessarily sex in the act term of it, but more the that eros, that passion spark of connection and how that manifests sometimes. And so it's a turning it back on yourself, and then sometimes not being able to see outside of yourself and your own urges and needs. And so that is an interesting definition of narcissism as well too from Freud. I found it interesting to go to Psychology Today and look at how they characterized it. And they characterize it as a grandiose sense of self-importance, a lack of empathy for others, a need for excessive admiration, and the belief that one is unique and deserving of special treatment. And that is more the disorder, the personality disorder, as opposed to narcissism, which comes from what Freud was kind of talking about as a developmental stage. So there's the developmental stage, which almost everyone goes through as they mature. And then there is the personality disorder, which is taking it to a dysfunctional level, to a sociopathy. The disorder is suspected when narcissistic traits impair a person's daily functioning. So it's when it starts to impact your relationship with others, the ways in which you do your job and your career and all of those sorts of things, where you are intolerant of others and there is this antagonism and attention seeking that comes in that takes over your life, is when it would then be considered narcissistic personality disorder, which is something totally different in a way than the natural narcissism of a developmental stage. There's also, I should say, malignant narcissistic personality disorder, which is an even more intense version of that. And as the name suggests, in malignancy, it causes great harm to those around them. Just as another kind of touch on this and how moving narcissism and Narcissus towards what I'd like to talk about today with reality TV and our sense of who we are in the world, is that a narcissist would distort their relationship of the self and other. They only see their own needs. They only see their own agenda. Everyone else kind of fades into the background. But I also want to focus on the definition of narcissist that talks about the that there's no real love towards oneself, right? It's not real love. It's not authentic love. It's a defense mechanism because they are, it actually belies a deep insecurity. I'm not a psychologist, but that is from what I've read, and some of you may have a little bit more insight into that than I do. But it's a intense inability to empathize with someone else, and that they only serve a purpose for that person out of need and expectation, but that it is not actually love. And as we move from that, from a narcissistic view of the world and from our in a sense necessary narcissistic developmental phase where we can only really see our own perspective and needs, most adults, as they develop through their life, I'm a social emotional learning teacher in middle school right now, and part of my goal is to teach my students, even at 11 to 13 years old, to think outside of themselves, to stand in someone else's shoes, to gain empathy, to gain a larger perspective, because that can only help us to also critical think in addition to caring about the people around us. But the truth is that the way that the mind is set up, it is nearly impossible for us truly to see through someone else's eyes. We can get as close as possible to it with our intentions being that way. But our mind's design is to help us survive. So it interprets the world around us so that it can give us the things that we need to survive. So it basically tells us this is a bad situation, this is a good situation. We want less of this, we want more of this. And it is constantly, a million times a moment, interpreting the world around us through our senses, through our memories, and then crafting a narrative on how we then interact in the world and with each other. And in a way that is almost a developmental narcissism, or I should say a narcissistic perspective, without it being a disorder aspect of things, because we are fulfilling our own needs and agenda and feeling safe. And that is how we operate in the world. And the more we try and step out of that, the bigger our perspective gets and the more empathy and authentic love we can feel. But we're still limited in what our mind's capacity is able to comprehend. There are practices that help people both on a spiritual level, on a meditative level, a religious level, that work to expand that even more. But your average person can only see what they can see and can only interpret the way in which their worldview will allow them. And that is the key point of how we're moving into the narratives of 2020, and how the world as reality versus illusion really does affect those narratives in how we interact with each other. So I wanted to just throw in two more little stories for you. These are folk tales. This one you might recognize. This is the Snow Queen. And in the beginning of the Snow Queen story, a demon has a mirror. And in this mirror, he's very excited because, and I'm going to read this a little bit to you. I have this written down. But this is the first story of the fairy tale, The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. And one day this demon was in a high state of delight because he had invented a mirror with this peculiarity, that every good and pretty thing reflected in it shrank away almost to nothing. On the other hand, every bad and good-for-nothing thing stood out and looked its worst. The most beautiful landscapes reflected in it looked like boiled spinach, and best people became hideous, or else they were upside down and had no bodies. Their faces were distorted beyond recognition, and if they had even one freckle, it appeared to spread all over the nose and mouth. The demon thought this immensely amusing. And so this idea of this projected reality, the mirror, that was how people saw themselves, just like Narcissus's reflection, right? This sense of, is what I'm looking at real? And interestingly, the next thing that happens in this story is that the mirror is shattered into millions of pieces, And these little shattered pieces go into people's hearts and eyes. So if you think about the metaphor of that deceptive view of the world, of what we're seeing, goes into our eyes, so it's how we're viewing the world, and it goes into our hearts, so it's how we're relating to the world, that the clarity has been already distorted and clouded over. And how can people then get to a point where they can clear that up again? How do we get those shards out in order to see what is actually happening, so that we can empathetically relate to each other and authentically relate to each other? How can Narcissus actually see what he is looking at, understand the importance of it, understand the significance and the message behind it, and redeem himself, as all of us? One last quick folktale, which I love this little story. This is a Japanese folktale, The House of a Thousand Mirrors. And it's basically the story of a little dog who hears that there is a house at the end of the street, and decides to go and explore it, and goes into it. And there's 1,000 mirrors there. And this is a happy little dog. And this happy little dog is just bouncing around and looking at these mirrors, and sees 1,000 other bouncy, happy little dogs looking back at him, and thinks, what a wonderful place. There's all these happy dogs. They're all bouncing around and looking at me. And goes off and bounces down the lane and tells their friend that they need to go check out this house. So this other little dog, who's feeling kind of grumpy and kind of angry at the world for whatever reason, bounds down the same street and goes into this house and looks around this mirror and sees 1,000 other grumpy, angry dogs as well too, looking back and barking. So he starts to bark at them and they bark back. And next thing you know, they're all barking at each other, and he's going, why did I even come in this place? I don't need to see more angry dogs. The world is already an angry place. And he goes off grumpily down the road. And so this idea of the mirror, or this idea of the reflective aspect of the world around us, is partially that part of ourselves that we are projecting out. I'll talk about the shadow in a moment, but also part of what everyone else is projecting out, and how that gets tied in to a narrative. Again, I love this quote, and it's attributed often to Anais Nin from Seduction of the Minotaur, but the same sentiment can also be traced back to the Talmud, can also be traced back to other writings over the year, but it's most associated with Anais Nin in this book. We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are. And Narcissus, when he looked in that pond, he saw himself as a handsome man that he wanted to possess. He couldn't see past that. He couldn't see past the surface image to really grasp the gravity of his situation. And in fact, it caused his demise. He stopped eating, he stopped drinking. All he wanted was to be there by that image, and to finally have it embrace him back, a person he could never have. And because of that, he withered away. And most of you know the rest of the story. So his body died, and in its place was found a narcissus flower, a daffodil. And his spirit went to Hades. And it's been said that he is still gazing at his reflection in the river Styx. Unless you read my dissertation, which has a whole nother story and a whole nother chapter for him, but that's for later. Okay, so, and then I love this Robert Johnson quote: if we can learn to love the inner enemy, then there is a chance of loving and redeeming the outer one. That understanding of who we are, what we're carrying, and what we're projecting onto the world can help us to shift that sense of the other, which is such an archetypal mainstay of human narrative development, of having to create an other. And that comes from the shadow, right? So the shadow is that which has not entered adequately into consciousness, the despised quarter of our being. And in a lot of myths, the shadow is represented by dragons, by snakes, by monsters, often if you take a culture's myth that has this kind of demon character or snake character and you transpose it onto the history of the time or a cultural belief at the time, you'll often see that it is ascribed to whoever is considered the other of that culture when that story was either first developed or in later iterations of it became pulled in. I'm thinking in terms of the King Arthur lore with the dragons and other assorted monsters were who they were fighting in the Crusades. So that would have been either the Muslims or the pagans in you know, the lands of Britain and northern France. I think in terms of actually so many other myths that all of a sudden there would be this character that is the representation of all that is evil. Most sacred stories and narratives and cultural narratives have a character such as that archetype. And that is the unacknowledged psychological content. We push it out onto others. So, you know, I'm going to be moving towards looking at the world today, but I think you can maybe see where I'm going in terms of this shadow content and how this shadow content shows up in the world. If almost everything is mythic, and as a mythologist, I'm predestined to think that way, that most things are constructed narratives. And so the way in which we see ourselves in the world, the way in which we see others in the world has a narrative attached to it. And often we create that other, that receptacle for all of our anger and our fear, so that we have someone, we don't have to carry it ourselves. And if we only realized that we can face it within ourselves, there's no need to push that onto creating another, which is definitely an oversimplification of that process, but it is the underlying core of the individuation process with Jung, that sense of really seeing all of who you are, all of the parts of yourself, and embracing them as a whole. That other that I was just mentioning, it's a place to put our fears, anger, and resentment. It's an opportunity to dehumanize without guilt, right? When there is a group that can bear that part of the narrative, then we don't have to care about them anymore. And of course, that's not true, but that's the way in which these constructed narratives often work. And if you watch the news or you look at history, there has always been varying others. And sometimes it's the same other throughout history. Sometimes it has a very specific span of time, depending on things that are going on in the world. Sometimes it's more fleeting, but there will be that other that it's very easy to say them. And but the process of doing that illusory process of declaring a group, an other or a them, helps us to dehumanize, helps us to do things that we would never normally do, and to say things that we can't even believe have come out of our mouth. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. There's also the other, which is the idealized version of who we want to be. There's that projected, it often comes out in transference, right? With either therapists or professors or doctors even, or someone we look up to, that we transfer that projection that they are amazing, wonderful, perfect human beings. It often happens with people in the public sphere, where we don't allow them to be human and make a mistake, because we have now put them on the pedestal. And that is a projection, of course, because they are a human being just like we are, with good and bad and everything in between. And so that is another way of projecting our shadow onto them, of everything good, everything we aspire to, that person represents. But the downside is, as soon as we do that, the work of taking them down has already begun. Because that is the next step of that othering in that sense. With Narcissus, his shadow was at first Amenius echo the different suitors that he has, that sense of projecting onto them that they're not good enough, that they are not quality enough, and that there was an aspect to himself that he projected onto them because he didn't even know them. So there was no way that he could have truly assessed that. But then in his stuckness with his image in the pond, his shadow becomes himself. It becomes the other part of him. And I believe, and this is why Dr. Downing and I had that big discussion, because I think that's his individuation moment. That's his opportunity to figure out that that other part of himself, that part of himself that is rejecting everyone and now is rejecting himself, if he can somehow integrate that, he can learn to be a whole person. So it's my ever optimistic view of Narcissus, but, and not people with narcissistic personality disorder, because that's a whole nother ballgame, but just that general narcissism. So I want to move now. Let me just check the time. Oh my goodness. Okay. So Emily, if you can help me along with, if, you know, I have a lot to talk about, but I know we have technically 2 hours, but I promise you I will not talk for 2 hours. But I'll get through as much as I can and then give some sort of signal. I'm sorry?
I'll still be here. It's okay.
All right. Yes. Just give me a signal if you're like, you're talking too much. Gotta cut it out here and start doing questions. Okay. I want to talk about reality TV because that's where I'm going next. So one of my thoughts is, how did we get here in 2020 when everyone's sense of reality is a different crafted narrative? Right? You could talk to someone and they could tell you what's actually happening now in the world, or why people are doing certain things, or what something means. And you look at them and you go, that's not what I'm seeing. That's not my sense of reality right now. And there's always been a level of that, but it has hit a fever pitch right now. And so I decided to go back and look at where did that shift potentially happen in the culture? Not necessarily in the human developmental stages, but in our culture. Where did that questioning of what's real and what's not real really start to take a hold? And one thing I've been looking at was reality TV, because when you think about reality TV, it should be reflecting reality, but it doesn't reflect reality. Most reality TV is in fact what's called soft scripted, which means that not every word is written or dialogue, but general character arcs, conflicts. Sometimes when they go into those confessional rooms and they're doing the one-on-one with the camera, sometimes they're fed a few of the things that they have to say, or the way in which they say it, or they tape it a few times. My parents are television writers, so I have a little bit of a viewpoint into some of how that stuff is doing. But it's not really reality. And a lot of it goes back to the very beginning parts of reality TV, which started with this hidden camera reality show. And so hidden cameras with candid camera, which for those of you who aren't familiar with it, although it did make a comeback not that long ago with, I think, his son came back and did another version of the show, but it was filming people without their knowledge. And sometimes an instigator, Alan Funt in the original ones, would say something or do something to get them to react. And then it was filmed. And that was most likely as natural of a reaction as possible, though I suspect there still were some contrived and constructed situations where it would maybe be anticipated that certain reactions would happen. But it was still very spontaneous in that sense. And there were all of these other sort of hidden camera realities, Queen for the Day, The Dating Game, and then we get into the more modern ones, To Catch a Predator, Scare Tactics, What Would You Do, Punk'd, which, by the way, I told all of my friends if they ever put me on Punk'd, they would never be my friend again, because I wouldn't survive that sort of that sort of hidden camera thing. And then Taxi Cab Confessions, and there's many, many, many more. But these are an example of that type of reality. We want to see what people would do when they don't know that they're being watched, right? It's funny because now we think we're in the time of Big Brother, where we kind of assume we're being watched, even when we might not be. So that's kind of taken a turn as well. And then, but what's considered to be the first official reality show was An American Family in 1973. This was the first time that they actually took a family and they had cameras in the home and they watched kind of what they were doing. They wanted a day in the life or a year in the life of a typical American family. And what was really interesting, I have some information written down about this because I was not as familiar with them at all. This is the Loud family. And it was 300 hours of raw footage that was edited down to 12-hour-long episodes. So that's also something that's talked about with reality TV is we're only seeing pieces of what occurred and they're edited. And so when you think about editing, that is storytelling. The choice to choose certain parts of a story is actually constructing a story. When I teach mythology in my undergrad classes, I usually give them an epic, something that is way, way too long for them to create a 10-minute play out of, and it's intentionally done. And then I ask them to pare it down to the essence of 10 minutes of that story where they can get all of the most important points out. They can be culturally sensitive and they can get the story across. And it's really interesting because part of the purpose of that lesson is to see what they determine as important, because it's going to be different. Each group is going to choose a different aspect of things. And that editing, that constructed reality tells you what they value. It's one of the reasons why I do that in the way that I do that. But I find that interesting with reality TV because it in essence, constructs that reality. They were an upper middle class family, lived in Santa Barbara. And they thought it was going to be, it was on PBS, and they thought it was just going to be, here's what a typical family, how they're living now in the 70s, but they got a lot more than they bargained for. There was a separation and a divorce. There was, the son came out, which had never been done on TV before. And there were a lot of kind of controversies that happened with it. So that leads to that other category of reality TV, which is the fly on the wall, right? Which a lot of that started also after American Family, The Real World, which was on MTV. And they had many iterations of that where people were living together in a home. It wasn't a competition the way Big Brother has become a competition. It was just simply, let's just see what happens when these strangers live together. How do they interact with each other? But often the natural conflicts that would arise between people were boosted so that they were bigger. And then you've got things from today. You've got Vanderpump Rules and Sister Wives and 90 Day Fiance and Chrisley Knows Best. And you've got all the celebrity shows like Hulk Hogan's Family Show and the Kardashians. You've got Gene Simmons' family. You've got A Normal Life, which was the Zappa family a number of years ago, and all of those constructed reality. And when you hear some of them talking now, I heard Sharon Osbourne talk a little bit about what it was like for her family to do that. One of her daughters even refused to be part of it because it felt such an invasion of what their actual day-to-day life was, if you could imagine having cameras all the time around you. And that made it really quite difficult. Then there's the competition reality show. There's many, many more than these, starting with Survivor and then Fear Factor, American Idol. So you've got the creative arts shows, and you've also got other challenges. Then you've got the ones for love interests like Bachelor and Bachelorette, the Flavor of Love, for any of you who remember that one, and some other kind of love, Beauty and the Geek, which were love-oriented ones. Then you've got the talent ones like Star Search, American Idol, and Dancing with the Stars. You've got The Apprentice and the Celebrity Apprentice, which is more for the business-oriented side of things. Project Runway, pretty much every aspect of life put into a competition, but then filmed and the drama constructed quite often. Improvement shows, right? What do we want to do? How do we want to make our house better? How do we want to make our body better? The Swan was about plastic surgery and changing someone from an ugly duckling to a swan. What does that say about our psyche that we would watch that? Or extreme makeovers. There's all the kitchen and the Tabitha's Salon and Bar Rescue, and all the home improvement shows. Some of these home improvement shows, after the fact, people were visited, and they said that a lot of the improvements were held together with duct tape, and that they had a lot of problems in the houses, months after they left or weeks after they left. And we're told that it was kind of up to them, because the image of making this beautiful house and doing it in only a couple of days was really all that the reality TV cared about. So is that actually reality or not? And the same thing with the makeovers and everything else. I know a lot of businesses who went out of business after going through kitchen nightmares and Bar Rescue. So while it does show us vicariously through these people who are going through trauma and trying to change something about their lives, what that could look like, so we can experience that, but it doesn't actually do that for that person all the time. Sometimes it might, but not always. And then there's the glimpse of reality, of real life, starting with That's Incredible back in 1980, about things that people can do, talents that people have. Judge Judy, People's Court, Cops, Undercover Boss, right? And then it leads us to even the celebrity news of what's happening right now in the world. So all of that gives us an image of what reality is supposed to be. But if we sit back and the young people today, one conversation that comes up a lot with them, especially in middle school, is this sense of, I want to look like that person. I want to act like that person. They're sought after. I once asked some of my middle school students what they want to do with their life. And some of them have said, I've already started, I want to be an influencer. So if their goal is to be an influencer and to be, have 1 million likes on Instagram, then I'm not doing my job fully, and I'm a little worried, to be honest. But that's an aspiration. So their view of reality, their view in the pond, is of that unattainable perfection or image that doesn't actually even exist for that real person. Because even those influencers and celebrities have been caught out quite often doctoring up the photos or constructing the experience so that it looks a certain way. And then you've got kids and frankly adults who think that their life is meaningless because they're not looking like that image in the pond. And that's very dangerous, I think. And it goes to the idea of the authentic versus the scripted, right? We think that these stories are all authentic, that even Judge Judy and People's Court, that they're coming in, they're being honest, this is their case. It's probably edited. A lot of the comments that the judges make would never be made in a normal courtroom, in terms of some of the for effect, right, and attitude and kind of like a lot of the digs at people, but also some of the things are scripted scenarios in many different forms of reality TV, soft scripted, so that it has a general arc, it has a general plan. There's going to be a villain. If there's no villain, have you ever noticed that a reality TV show is kind of boring? You have to have someone to root against. You want to have the people to root for. And there's a court show called something in Providence. I forget what the first part, there's a word that starts with a P, in Providence. And it's basically this really sweet judge who gives people a second chance. They come in, they tell their story, and he goes, you really shouldn't be doing that, but I understand you're going through a really hard time. Here's what I'm gonna offer you. And if you flip from that to Judge Judy or People's Court, it's a whole nother ballgame, right? Nobody watches that show in Providence because it's so nice, right? People watch because they want to see people be eviscerated. There's that reality need for the other. So this is just a quote from J. Rupert Thompson about reality being a manipulated format, where real people are put in unreal situations to create a story. And so it's very compelling because you don't really know what's real and what's not real. But when we get suckered into living vicariously through that person, then we become unsure of the line between reality and illusion. And I think that in looking at that need to know what's real, many of us are seekers throughout our life to know what's real. What is the meaning of things? How do I interpret things? That it's very unsettling when you no longer know what's real and what's not. And entertainment has gone from what is obviously a scripted drama or comedy, like a sitcom with canned laughter or an audience that is going to have a predictable reaction, to reality television where we're supposed to think that these are real people living their real lives. But if you ran into them in the supermarket, they may not be that way at all. And I worked for a while in publicity and promotion in the entertainment industry. And a lot of times I would meet these people and they were very, very different than their public persona because they put on a persona. They are acting in a lot of ways. They are creating a character. But because we're not privy to that most of the time, we think what we're seeing is real. And this leads me to Campbell's 4 functions of mythology, which many of you probably are familiar with. It's the ways in which a culture or a group construct their reality. Their stories, their sacred narratives, their folk tales fall into these functions in order to help that society establish itself, understand itself. One is cosmological, that sense of how we got here, how the world was created and people were created and all of that. There's the psychological, which is the stages of life from birth to death, the milestones, the rituals that make meaning for that. The sociological, the moral and ethical right and wrong of a culture and a society. How do we know what those are unless we hear the stories? Right? And then it's a agreed upon social construct of narratives so that we know what is accepted in that society. In America, there are rules that are different than if you were to go to another country. Within America, and you go to different regions of America, there are different rules. If you go to within those regions, different neighborhoods, there may be different rules. Yet again, those narratives are not only these ancient mythic stories, but they're still being constructed today just in the things that we hear. So a lot of the sociological narrative that kids see, they think is what is accepted, is what they see on Instagram, what they see on reality TV, what they see adults talking about. That becomes their sociological narrative. That determines their story of reality. So we have to be really careful with it. And the numinous and the metaphysical, that sense of the awe and the wonder in the world, and how do things all fit in together? How are they happening? Things that have no other kind of explanation. And I always want to mention, this was not one of Campbell's, but the etiological function, which is a lot of what people originally think that mythology is all about, which is explaining scientific occurrences, but through metaphor. And it is what mythology is sometimes used for, and a lot of stories do point to those things. But I think it's really important to see mythos and narrative, not only ancient and cultural, but modern narratives, as a construction of our reality. How is the mind understanding these stories and seeing these stories around us, consciously or unconsciously, and living them, which is what a mythos does create for a group. So how are we living this mythology where we don't know the difference between reality and illusion? And that leads me to the news, because the news has gone from Walter Cronkite days, where it was factual information, to pundits who are opinion-based, right? So they're telling you their thoughts about what's happening. They're giving you their opinions, but it's not objective. However, many of them are now saying that it's objective. So then we're left with what is reality and illusion? Because you watch one channel and your facts and your information are completely different than you watch in another channel and your facts and your information. So then there's no ground to stand on. The narratives have diverged. And so we don't know what our reality is anymore. We know what we think resonates with our reality, but your neighbor or your partner or your parents all of a sudden have a different reality. And that can be super unsettling. It's Narcissus again, looking into the pond and not necessarily seeing what's really there, seeing what is reflected and what's projected back. And so that's the objective and the subjective storytelling. There's often a hook. Years ago, when I was out of work and I was looking for a job, I applied to, I didn't actually apply, there was an ad for a news syndicate that was looking for storytellers. They weren't looking for reporters, they weren't looking for journalists, they were looking for people to take a bit of information that was gathered and craft a story that would bring in viewers. And there are some if you understand how myth is created, there's definitely ways to do that, but it didn't feel to me like it was where I wanted to go, because I didn't want to contribute to the diverging realities that were starting to happen. The idea of censorship, outright saying you can't say that and not allowing people to say it, and the more subtle bias, which not everyone can determine where that's coming from. That's that line of illusion again. Comedy news. For years, between Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update, the Jon Stewart's show, Stephen Colbert, the Colbert Report, even though he was in character, quite often they were delivering factual information, but in a comedic way. And a lot of people got things from them, ironically, as the news organizations became more entertainment-like, became more opinion. And so that line was blurred, because now we didn't even know where to get our actual factual information from. And then you have the internet, where now you have people who are bloggers and you have people who are giving their opinions as fact, and that not to trust the news as you used to get it, because look, they're biased now and they have their narratives, right? So that's the narrative that brings you now to the underground news sources. But who knows who's vetted the underground news sources? So now you have a creation where it's all the pond and it's all the reflection, and we don't know what's real and what's not real anymore. And so those creations of new narratives, reporters and journalists as storytellers, and these underground truth tellers of the conspiracy theorists and bloggers and all of that, there are so many sources of information, but how do we vet what's real? How do we see the image in the pond and know whether what we're looking at is real or not, whether what we're looking at is going to create our demise, or whether or not it's going to bring us truth? So I'm going to go very quickly through this next part because I just realized what time it is. And so the idea of myth-making narratives as reality. The next 4 slides, which you'll be able to see, I'll send this the slide deck to anyone who'd like to see it, refers to Christopher Flood and his writing of Myth and Ideology from Thinking Through Myths. And he talks about how we create these stories and create propaganda, if you will, or create narratives that are intended to move people to one view or another, and then potentially to action. And sometimes it's just that you don't have as much information as you thought you did. So you're going on very little information. And sometimes it's because ideological bias has distorted it. We have a certain worldview. We can only accept that that worldview is correct. And so anything outside of that is very hard to construct. So stories get constructed from that place. The unmasking of a deliberate manipulation of people who are trying to drive an agenda, trying to drive an illusion, and that can also contribute to this. And the last is a mixture of all of those things, which I think is what's happening right now, where we no longer know what people's motives are. Some of them are more obvious than others, and some people, it's just they're just putting forward what resonates in them, for them, as truth, because it fits in with their previous fears or their previous views of other people or of the world. And so it's the easiest leap for them to make. And societal control often lies with the best myth makers. I believe this to be true. I believe this in terms of the media, in terms of public relations and advertising and everything else, even in lawsuits and everything. If you can tell the best story, the one that resonates, the one that connects into someone. This is why I'm never chosen in voir dire when I go for jury duty, because I explain this, and quite often the lawyers look at me and go, because I can see that it's all constructed narrative. So whoever tells the best story wins. It has nothing to do with right or wrong, unfortunately. It should, but it doesn't. So brings me to the end here, which is the year 2020, and all of the things that we've been facing: a worldwide pandemic, racial reckoning, civil unrest, contentious election, which is still happening, QAnon, and all of these stories about underground cabals and things that are happening behind the scenes, and evidence of that, wildfires, hurricanes, so much more. All of these things are going on, and they're all individual stories that carry so many nuances depending on our own worldview going into them. And then the information that we're hearing, no one really knows who to trust on any of these topics. We trust our own echo chamber. We try and trust our own critical thinking, our own gut. But even that can sometimes betray us if we don't know what we're looking at is an illusion. If we have always gone to the same advisors and the same guides to tell us things, and if they are now living in a different narrative than us, then all of a sudden our ground is even shakier. And this idea of seeing 2020, right? This metaphor of seeing things more clearly versus the divergent truths of reality, right? Conspiracy theories create these new narratives. They distrust other ones. My favorite thing is I have someone in my life who loves conspiracy theories, and they say everyone else is sheep because they believe this, but what they can't see is all they've done is they're following a different narrative. They've fallen out of the more mainstream narrative and into a different narrative, and in a sense become sheep to that narrative. And that's what narrative does, right? I don't know what's true and what's not true. I couldn't tell you because I'm also in this same world, but I can see how narratives pull us in and how we can then reject other narratives so that we can feel better about the narrative that we subscribe to. And echo chambers help with that. If everyone around you is supporting that same thought, then when someone comes in with new information, it hits that cognitive dissonance. If you're already into that narrative and that narrative has now formed your worldview, and if it's tied into your survival, your very survival in the world, then cognitive dissonance will keep you from to the idea that maybe your narrative, maybe what you're seeing in the pond is not what's actually real. Just going to skip this quote from Jung. It's a great quote, but I'm going to move on to our modern day Narcissus, which is honestly, that's what he's looking at now. So this idea of social media, this idea of the various pundits and the opinion-oriented news, the idea of any of these modes of information now, that's how we're seeing ourselves, how we're projecting ourselves into the world. And it does come from that sense of losing that sense of where the line is between reality and illusion, coming from almost an insecurity in our development of wanting to be safe, wanting to be okay, wanting to be liked and part of community and belong. And when you don't have a ground to stand on, it makes it very difficult to discern that. And so I do think that Narcissus can be redeemed. I wrote a whole book about it. I think that he needs to understand the nature of the reflections and be given the opportunity to really see them for what they are. And I love this scene from The Matrix where he finally does get a sense of what is real and what is not real, and that the reflection is not what he thinks it is. And again, a wonderful quote to end with here. Such a man, someone who has acknowledged the magnitude of their shadow, knows that whatever is wrong in the world is himself. And if he only learns to deal with his own shadow, he has done something real for the world. He has succeeded in shouldering at least an infinitesimal part of the gigantic, unsolved social problems of our day. This idea that if we can see that a lot of the things that we are seeing is this projected illusion, not that things aren't actually occurring, things are actually occurring in our experience, the phenomenal experience of the world, but our interpreted narrative about what it means for us, and what we need to do about it, when we can finally own what is real and what is not real, what is authentic, then we can embrace everything that is occurring, and we can actually move forward. And I leave you with this question: what stories are we living now? What stories are you living now? What do you believe, and why do you believe it? And why do you trust the source that it came from? And Narcissus never really questioned that. Narcissus just looked into the pond and saw himself, and that was enough for him. And it also caused his demise. So I thank you for that. I have a list of, I'm putting this up now so that you can, if anyone wants to watch this back, you can see some of the sources that I consulted or referenced along the way, some links as well. And that is it for me. Thank you so much for listening to me talk for so long.